Welcome to Mindcrime LIberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss the case against children. Tim.
This is somewhat a provocative title slash topic, but I'm going to start with my general title here. Life is mostly suffering. This is sort of like the TLDR version of this case against kids. You can try to go full theodicy or deny suffering, but if you examine one's life or others' life or the common life, that you realize that a decent portion of life consists of some form of suffering. Now, maybe I'm being over the top. Maybe this is being somewhat ridiculous and reductio absurdum. But even if you find, to quote the book title, find freedom in an unfree world, you're left with the problem of continuing it. So even if you do manage to carve out a non-suffering life for yourself, will your children's lives be good too, if you indeed have children? And I think this is interesting to face for people on the dissident political perspective or dissident political thinkers, because many people have the idea that things are in quote-unquote decline. Now, I don't know if I hold that view. I'm ambivalent about it, but I'm going to make some empirical points, which I think people on the quote-unquote right or quote-unquote conservatives or quote-unquote libertarians or quote-unquote reactionaries should ask themselves if they're having children. The U.S. is in debt, $36 trillion. Western Europe and the United States has been facing multiple waves of immigration. We have huge AI surveillance, technocracy, all sorts of erosion of rights. Now, you could always say none of this stuff existed in the past, and that's part of what the maneuvering I would do too. We've always had debt. We've always had immigration. We've always had threat of technology. There's also other problems. Now, of course, if you're in the left-wing perspective, you might say climate change. There's an NPR article that I like to always bring up where there's a couple and the guy doesn't want another child because he doesn't want another polluter. But if you're going to make the claim, and a lot of people on the right will make the claim that things are getting worse. I don't know if you will. I don't know if others will. But at some point, people will make that. I'm ambivalent to repeat. Why have children if things are going to be worse in the future? It's very unlikely that your kids are going to save the world. People try to say, well, my kid will be a light in the dark world. Okay, maybe. That's possible. But that's also kind of, it's unclear. I have to repeat, I read the book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World during COVID lockdowns in the United States, and it kind of changed me. One of the central points he made is don't try to save the world. And also another sub point he made is if you have a way out, a way to quote unquote find freedom, don't tell other people about it and don't advertise. Which I think poses a problem for the next generation, so to speak. Now, it could be that your kids will just figure it out, but it's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. So, again, why have children if the world isn't as seemingly good as it could be or might be? Again, you could go full Panglossian here and say that there is no suffering, that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Go full like right-wing Matt Ridley optimist here and say we live in the perfect world. We have more technology than ever. Everything's great. You could go full Stephen. This guy that Nassim Taleb debated. I forget what his name is. I'll think of it later. But if you think we're going to make a plank that we're going to get to an ideal world, we're probably not going to get to an ideal world in 200 years, or let alone 20. So if you have children now, it's unlikely that in 20 years they will be, living in that ideal world. And if your political position holds that, income inequality is increasing, or debt's increasing, or the rights of man are eroding, or immigration, or whatever, why have children? So again, my first question here is, speaking of suffering, is we spend a lot of our lives working jobs which we don't like doing, or something that the receivers of those jobs that you do don't want. Alasdair MacIntyre makes the point in one of his lectures/papers that, and he's somewhat, again, he's a leftist in some ways economically, even though he writes a reactionary tome known as After Virtue, which actually explains why he's a reactionary. But in children's books, the job McIntyre would say the jobs listed are generally jobs which are seemingly useful or productive in a way the child would understand, like a piano player or a piano tuner or a carpenter or something like that, a bus driver. Most people, especially quote unquote breadwinning jobs, don't wind up with those kind of things. Now, it could be that you're the one case that's different. But a lot of people end up working for warehouses, for mega corporations like Amazon or Lowe's or whatever. Factory farms. Again, I'm not a vegan, but I'm well aware of how most food is farmed. School test taker tutor, just so kids get high grades so they go to universities and take exams. Prison guards, militarized police / SWAT. Military will make work, or actual military, which for destroying countries on behalf of Israel or behalf of against Russia, Ukraine, so forth. Tax collector, corporate lawyer, a corporate lawyer that sues other people, a regulator. None of these jobs would show up in Alasdair or McIntyre's books, and these are the kind of jobs that tend to make good money that allow people to stay home or have their wives stay home. So or if you do have a job that's seemingly virtuous, like let's say an optometrist, a guy who makes glasses. The last few times I've gotten my glass prescriptions renewed, and the only reason I have to get it renewed is because the website requires it. It cost me $15 to get it renewed online. I set my laptop up 20 feet away, and my prescription hasn't changed in 5 years. But in theory, you're supposed to renew it every year or 2 years. That's just a racket. So, one of the things that libertarians, funnily enough, and socialists some good socialists, like this idealistic form, but also right libertarians will do, is many of their jobs that they have might go away if you actually did the revolution that you want. How many people in fire, in finance, in insurance, in real estate, and education jobs would go away if, you had the kind of things you want to have. Now, again, they might turn around and argue, oh, well, prices would go down, or we'd reach the land of milk and honey and so forth. Maybe. Brian Kaplan writes a book making the case for having a lot of kids, but because GMU is a semi-private public institution, I know how much money he makes. He makes $195,000 a year. That's not, again, it is Northern Virginia. I get it. That's one of the most expensive areas in the world. But that's not nothing either, even in Northern Virginia. I don't think he's hungry. So I do think people. So again, one of these big reasons people don't have children, which is one of the reasons I get kind of annoyed at the abortion debate, is it's an economic selection affection problem. Having kids in modernity is expensive. Yes, there are ways to make them cheaper, but there's no good. As Elon Musk would say, nothing useful is accomplished on 40 hours a week. So if you want to ask me why I don't have children, is I don't make enough money to comfortably have children. And since Swithin Life's Grok data, here's some data. So I asked Grok, do single people make less lifetime earnings? And again, some of this is the selection effects. Actually, I'd say a lot of his selection might be the selection effects. But married individuals earn 26% more annually than singles. And never married men earn, and this is the United States, $42,000 annually versus $83,000 for married men. Now that's household adjusted, but individuals' wages follow suit due to promotions and hours. So one of the reasons people put up with the job as the corporate lawyer or the SWAT team guy or the prison guard or work at the aircraft carrier off the coast of Venezuela or the Mediterranean Sea, and again, those people make good money if you look at the whole package, is for their kids. So maybe this is brought up in the James Bond movie, actually. One of the reasons James Bond is viewed as disposable. That's because has unmarried. So there is a thing where and we're in the sort of age where there's less useful breadwinning jobs. Not everyone can make middle manager. No, I mean, this is what Keith Preston would call the overproduction of elite. Not Keith Preston, as another academic theorist would have. So a lot of the jobs that people talk about don't really exist. And I've also out on the periphery, scary religion has died. Now, of course, you might say, well, I believe in scary religion. But like the scary religion, as in, that makes sex outside of marriage for reproduction verboten, as well as that implores people to do that to get into these kind of relationships, no longer exists. So like, if there is a Christianity out there, it's kind of like Jesus is my friend type Christianity. It's not the kind of Jesus to judge. And again, maybe the fundamentalists, the scary people, do have more kids than everyone else. But the nicer people have more kids than the nice religious people have more kids than the outright secular. So Swithin, why have kids? I brought up the point about suffering. I brought up the point about work. I brought up the points about the decline of like angry religion. What do you make of this case? I mean, it's kind of a mishmash in some ways, but like my core point, as I was open, is life is suffering. One of the reasons people put up suffering is so they can have kids. And actually a lot of guys complain about their jobs, and I've heard you to some extent complain that you're making money and your kids and wives spend it. But it's like, isn't that part of the package? Isn't that what you're signed up to do to a certain extent when you got married and have kids? So sometimes I roll my eyes when I sometimes jibe at you. It's a joke, but I also like in somewhat serious about it. What do you make of this case against kids? I mean, are you happy with having kids overall, Swithin?
Well, yes, I am. But I'm just trying to follow exactly what your claim is. Are you claiming that men would be happier subjectively if they hadn't had kids in most cases? Or are you saying that it would be immoral to bring children into the world because they'll suffer? A combination of the two, or something else?
I would say a combination of two. I think it was if it was straightforward that if it was the quote unquote, Hans Hoppe likes to joke about the Garden of Eden, but if it was the Garden of Eden and everything, there was no scarcity, a lot of the costs of having children would go away. A lot of like the sort of, like if everyone got like free money and you could just have kids, you just had to do the work in raising them. That'd be one thing. But one of the reasons why people don't have kids is because they're just repeating the same life thing over and over again. Like, well, I have to suffer, therefore they will have to suffer. It's a bit of a both. It's a two-pronged attack I'm making, and somewhat hypothetical. I may eventually have them on my own. So you could say that's a performative contradiction. So it's somewhat hypothetical.
Okay, so when it comes to suffering, well, yeah, clearly. But then the question arises, how bad does the world need to be a bad place to bring kids in? So, I mean, for instance, I suppose, unless you are somebody who has, in fact, committed suicide or intend to, that you probably think being alive is better than being dead. Although you could argue that's not a fair comparison, because the comparison would be never to have existed and being alive rather than having being alive and then killing yourself. So you could say that's a different comparison. So I think, just on empirically, people tend to prefer existing. So even if things are really bad or get worse, that most people you would talk to prefer to be alive than to be dead, and they act in such a way to remain alive. The next then is about, would you be better off if you didn't have children than if you did have children? Now, with the jobs you mentioned, it is perfectly true that a lot of guys will put up with bad jobs for their kids and their wives. That's true. However, you got to think about, well, how bad are these jobs compared to what? Because there's a lot of really bad lower-level jobs. Now, you could argue that they have the advantage that they typically have shorter working hours. And so then you can focus on doing something that you find interesting. But, it just seems to be the case that a lot of jobs are bad jobs. So pointing out the ones which earn more of not being great in middle management, which they undoubtedly may not be, I don't see why they're necessarily any worse than sort of low-level shop floor jobs. in many cases, working for Walmart or something, Target. I mean, that doesn't sound like a hugely interesting or fulfilling job. And on the fulfillment point, it seems to me to be the case that people want to do something productive with their lives. They want to engage in some form of meaningful work. I used to ask this of some of my classes, if you were a multi-billionaire, what would you do with your time? And you always ended up having to do something that wasn't simply just watching TV, playing games. You would want to do something productive. So even if you did play games, you might end up being some sort of YouTuber of some description, because it just seems to be the case that now, for whatever reason, humans want to do something that they think has value and provides value to others. And so it seems to me then that children are a classic case of that by raising them and doing stuff for them, and you seem like you're providing value to them, and it's on sort of like a personal level, and so therefore provides meaning to the parents. Now, you could argue, and true, that it probably provides more meaning to the mother than the father in most cases. But if you're going to be a guy with no kids, you're going to need to have something else that you can do, which is kind of valuable to you. So yeah, okay, maybe if you can work fewer hours and you can work in that, fine. Obviously, other examples historically where this has been the case, if you join the clergy or been a monk or something, in which you didn't have children, but then you devote your life to the church, and then you would find meaning in devoting your life to the church. I'm just skeptical of whether or not you were somebody with no kids, or compare this situation. Some guy who works at Walmart who has no kids compared to a guy who tries to climb up the corporate hierarchy at Walmart with kids. Doesn't seem to me to be obvious that the guy with no kids on the lowest rung of Walmart is any in a better situation than the guy who's more up the has long working hours at Walmart that has kids. But you are certainly right; they are expensive and they come at a large opportunity cost. It's just, what else would you do with the time that you might have without kids, I think, is the key question.
The what else question I will put aside for a moment, but I will go back to the work point. I guess the thing is that, and I think what's interesting is, I think people who are like quote unquote responsible parents clearly understand this. But one of the things I notice with all my people my age or around my age, is when they get kids, they're not as involved in other activities as much as they used to be, for one thing. So I see them less, and also I noticed that in some ways they just seem more quote unquote stressed. So like I do, and also because of the cost, it makes them, and this is actually one of the reasons why employers like, and again, they can't explicitly do this, but I know, and again, I'm not criticizing it. I'm not like against, but employers like to hire people with kids because they're more likely to stay. You have like leverage over them. The single guy who's free to leave, he's a bit of a, wild card, so to speak. That this shows up in all sorts of ways, implicit ways. So I will say that if you want to have kids the right way, which is part of the reason why I have such heterodox views on abortion, compared to most to the right. If you want to have kids in the quote unquote responsible manner, then I think you have to understand that there is a quote unquote trade-off there, and you have to be in a position to somewhat provide. And many people might be in just enough position to provide themselves a half decent life, but not replicate it. And that's one of the areas which the right is under appreciative of, what like the economic factors. Again, the libertarian right is very good at it, because they'll talk about housing and stuff like that, and like all the implicit costs of other things. So I agree, that's great, but there is a huge cost burden, and the only way to solve the cost burden is to make money, and the only way to make money is to have a useful skill. Now, it is true, that you'd have to do that probably anyway, but not nearly to the same degree. And you could enjoy the fruits of it, not someone else. So as far as the opportunity cost, I think this is where like viewing kids. This is where might be the errors of Brian Kaplan, but like. And this somewhat shows, I think John Piper, he's an American Calvinist, was once asked, or it might have been Doug Wilson, was once asked, if his kids end up in hell, would he be bummed out? And he said no. And I think this is like the most, like, this is like an absurdium of the question, but it was Doug Wilson, I believe, who said this. And he said, no, it's God's will, it's not mine. They're not my kids. And I think that's an interesting way to answer the problem. It'll be like an extreme version. Because that's one thing that David Bentley Hart brought up in his book, That All Should Be Saved, regarding Ed Feser, because Ed Feser is, Aquinas, and Hart thought that Aquinas was a Calvinist. Now, I think being boiled alive eternally and all, like that would be the worst outcome for any person, like eternity. That's even worse than like being boiled alive here on Earth. That's just maximum suffering. I think that's an interesting extreme version of the suffering problem, of an extreme version of this, now again, this might be quote unquote far afield of like work life suffering, but let me bring it back to that. I would say work life suffering, like to some extent, why do people quote unquote fall, or why do people not put up with this seeming as if world? Again, not the ideal world that intellectuals and political thinkers and theologians talk about, but the current existing world. I think one of the reasons this is why I have also heterodox views of mental illness. Like, people just quote unquote crack under pressure, and children are a huge added pressure. Now, it could be that children are the quote unquote thing that ties you down and makes you sane. But it also could be the opposite. It could be that, like, if you give people who are on edge children, they'll just totally break. They'll totally, crack under pressure, so to speak, and fall apart. That'd be my thing. So, like, what's the alternative? I'd say, the alternative is, like, your example is, of the Walmart example is, it could be quite stark. Like, if you try and fail, it might be worse off than not trying and just muddling along as is, a kind of conservative approach to life rather than a kind of risk-taking life. Because I would say there is a risk in having kids. Maybe it's not as stark as I'm making out to be, but I don't think it's zero. Now, there's a huge upside, but there is a risk. That'd be my point. So, what do you make of that?
Sure, risk. But I suppose the question then arises: what do you want to do? Do you want to live the risky life that has great rewards, or do you want to play it safe and live sort of a mediocre life? I suppose I want to be in the sort of risky, heroic life. One thing about modern society is the way in which and safetyism prevents sort of heroic risk, because it doesn't conform to the code, and we got to minimize this because this is going to have bad impacts, and people might be hurt. So what? Society would never get where it is today if the type of regulatory state that existed today existed in the industrial period. The industrial period just simply wouldn't have taken off, because you just wouldn't have been allowed to. So yeah, I think there's risk, but again, there's risks on both sides. So I think it very much depends on the individual in question as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So clearly, Melissa getting knocked up by Tyrone on a regular basis is probably not a good idea, assuming it's a different Tyrone, which it might well be. So I'm certainly not advocating sort of reckless fertility maximization, as it were. But I think, you know, that the sort of heroic risk, as it were, to that. I mean, so, what else was I going to say? On the theodicy thing, I mean, obviously one thing is, you know, you're not causing your children, assuming that eternal conscious torment is the way, and you know, you're not causing your kids to do that, and you don't know whether they will, and you could then say, well, you know, they have the chance of being in heaven, and so, you know, bring them in, because they could have some great upside rather than just, oh no, there might be this very big downside. You know, you have both as an option. But again, that of course assumes in certain sense that the future is open rather than closed. So that's a slightly different question. This is a point I was going to make before. Even though you might think that parents look like they're sort of disheveled and sort of in not in great health or something like that, because the kids are tiring them out or whatever. You could make the similar case, though, to somebody who is working all their time on a business. And you could go, well, working on this business is really bad because, look, you're stressed out, you're doing all this stuff for the business. So then the question is, you know, what are you attempting to achieve? And if that's the best way to achieve it, and you still think that goal is a worthy goal to achieve, then that's something that, you know, the cost, as it were, is worth it. Another thing as well with children, which is important, in a sense, family ties are more important now than they have been historically, given how mobile people typically are. Because if you just got regular friends, you don't tend to keep in contact with them in the way with family you will. So insofar as you don't want to live alone when you're old, or simply just assume you're married, just have your wife or husband, then having children is kind of an investment in the fact that you will have things to do in the future and sort of continue a meaningful existence in the long run. Because just having friends and whatever, what was it? I remember coming these news articles, like some women complaining that, oh yeah, all my when I had a kid, all my friends just like left me alone. It's like, well, yeah, of course they are. They're your friends. They're not going to muck in and help, are they? They're not your family. If they were, they probably would. So having people who have like blood relatives to you seem to have a greater obligation towards you, and so then you have this longer, more thicker, as it were, social circle, which is advantageous in the long run. So yeah, that's how I'd respond to.
Do you think political dissidents, or anyone who's politically aware, whether they're on the far left or the far right, are overplaying the doomerism, and are they engaging in performative contradiction if they're having children while at the same time believing whatever doomsday scenario, technocracy, immigration, debt, climate change? Again, pick your poison. There's a lot of different ones you could pick. Some of them may happen, some of them may not happen. I'm not here to talk about them, but although maybe I am a little bit. But do you think that they are engaging in a performative contradiction if they're having children, or let me steel man this a little bit? Like, even if we're going to be all, I don't know, slaves of AI, or I don't know, debt slaves, or occupied by the Chinese, or occupied by the Zionists, or occupied by whoever. Whatever bugaboo you want to talk about, the COVID Fauci is just going to rule everybody. Even if that was coming true, do you think it would be permissible or good to have children in that kind of environment, regardless of it? But to go back to my first question there, do you think they're overplaying their hands? Is that a performative contradiction? But even if all these, and then secondly, if these doomsday scenarios are happening, do you still think it's a good thing to have children, even if the doomsday scenarios are happening? What would you say to that?
Well, yes and yes. So I think yes and yes. I don't think it's a performative contradiction. Well, it depends. So if you think that even though you might be heading in a bad situation, whether you individually can actually have a relatively meaningful existence, then bringing kids into the world is not a performative contradiction. If you think that basically, even irrespective of what system you're in, you have within yourself the ability to make a mark on the external world, to have agency. Then you can have, internally a relatively sort of meaningful existence. So, for instance, there was, I can't remember his name, Stockdale. I wrote an article recently. He was captured by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War and was he put in solitary confinement for a long time? He was very into Stoic philosophy, and he was he was tortured and whatever. And he was like, well, no, they can break my body, but they cannot break my spirit. They have no control over that. And even in this sort of terrible situation, now clearly he would prefer not to have been there than being there. But even there, he had the mindset that he has some control, and over the areas which he has control, he will exercise control. And a lot, I think, of well-being, as it were, and sort of happiness and having a generally positive disposition is on whether or not you can have an impact on your own life in the external world. And I think that's basically possible everywhere and always. And I'm not a fully paid up Stoic, but the Stoics would be the best exemplar of that kind of way of thinking. However, if you're somebody who is like so for instance, it might be the case that some crazed feminist would be having a contradiction, because if they're just like permanent victims and have no agency whatsoever, then yeah, sure. But insofar as you can have at least some agency, then there's value, I think. So I don't think there's a performance contradiction in that case.
Well, do you think it's a performative contradiction that like Ron Paul has 5 kids, considering what Ron Paul thinks about the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, and so forth? And and also, I don't think it's surprising. Actually, I think Ron Paul is a fairly smart guy, and he has 5 kids. But it's not an exact correlation. But as IQ goes up, fertility typically drops, especially for females, but for men more or less. And PhD holders, for example, have a 1.3 here in the United States. This is from Grok, and in Norway, these are some other Grok data. I'm just saying, the top 20%, the top IQ quartile since 1960 has a 20% lower fertility than the bottom quartile in IQ. Now, again, you can dispute IQ if you want. It's a good proxy. So to me, people who are quote unquote aware in a thick sense. Now, again, you could always bring up this meme. Rick Story likes this meme, the meme of the no bidwit meme. But like, if you look at the no high school people, they have lots of children, relatively speaking. Here in the United States as well as elsewhere. But like Ron Paul is a quote unquote smart person in the normal way we think about it. Same with Ed Fazer, both of them. I would say you two, who have a decent number of children, more than just 2, by the way. Why is that? Like, do you think there's something, sterilizing about reading or intellectual ideas that make people like depressed? You said you're not a fully paid up Stoic. Do you think there's something depressing about either intelligence or lots of knowledge? Because I don't think this is new either. I think this has always been a phenomenon that, to a certain extent, intellectuals, and just because our society is, maybe it's not exactly intellectual focused, but it's more intellectual focused than many societies, than like ancient Sparta, for example. What would you make of this argument regarding intelligence and fertility and not having children? Because I don't think Ron Paul is an outlier in that regard.
My understanding is that relationship only started existing in the late 19th century, and the quote-unquote eugenicists were very concerned about it. In the Middle Ages to the industrial period, at least, the higher IQ people, who were richer people in general, who tend to correlate with IQ, would have more surviving children than poorer people, which has been, Hopper argues this is part of sort of like genetic uplift of the British population, which then led to the Industrial Revolution, because basically the average intelligence level was high enough. Or probably best to say there was enough men with outlier high IQ to have technological developments, etc., and have the appropriate personality profile to be able to make great leaps forwards. Now, that said, I mean, Matt Ridley does seem to be correct that a lot of it is trial and error, but you need intelligent guys to sort of perform the trial and error in a pretty good way. So it does seem to be the case as well, I think, especially men, that testosterone levels are higher with lower IQ, which would sort of correlate with some form of virility, and therefore, have more kids. So I think that's mostly the intelligence thing. I think is true to some extent, but when it comes to PhDs and stuff do mess things up a bit, but particularly with women, I mean that's just going to mean that they're going to be outside their most fertile window, and so therefore you're going to expect fewer kids, and that's not necessarily an IQ thing. That's more of we're doing PhD things, and therefore outside of the reproductive market in that sense. So is there something depressive about being intellectual? In a certain sense, yes, it's true. I think the organized police and the standing army and the sort of division of labor that's taken place today, you don't really have the cultural cultural imagination for sort of like the warrior philosopher or the intelligent warrior or something like that, which you probably would have more if it was the case that you had militias rather than standing armies, and or self-defense was expected, and you wouldn't really farm everything out to law enforcement or something along those lines. If true, even kind of intellectual types would be sort of directed more, at least in part, into sort of physical activity, and they probably in better shape. And I think, pretty sure, if you're in better shape, you have a high testosterone level. I think fat reduces your testosterone levels, and so that would then correlate to the number of children you had. So, but I do think it's the case, though, that if you're more intelligent, you find more things interesting, and so there's more things to do other than have sex and have children. But I don't think this is something you necessarily would have. Now, whether or not you'd always get differential, whether you'd get differential birth rates between the poorer and the richer is another question. I'm not sure about that, but yeah, that'd be the way
I would say there's a difference between the guy who owns a plumbing service or a engineer or something like that, and someone who's a college professor. You could say both are quote unquote intelligent, but I think there's a difference in career paths. I don't think it's a surprise that religious people, I was just thinking about the church I kind of attend. I was just doing a survey of in my head of what they did, and most of them work in. This goes back to my Alasdair McIntyre point. They work in folksy trades of some type. They don't work in the fire or let alone the intellectual sphere as much, which again poses a problem for the long-term elite selection of like WASP America, so to speak. I think that poses a problem, the sort of leaving of that thing. And it may have been true in the 1800s or 1700s, but in the past 150 years, especially with the rise of contraception, intellectuals, and this is true for almost everywhere, and males as much as women, have very few children, 20 to 40% fewer compared to in like UK, men with doctorates by age 50 have 1.35 children. versus 2.1 for all men. And this is longitudinal studies I was looking up through Grok just to prepare for this, because this was one of the side questions I had. Because, see, I think if you think about the why question behind that, I think there is something about intelligence that just makes, maybe it's a lot of intelligence will get to a point of optimism. But, like, there is just a way in which, like, the stupid, not the stupid, I mean this this is like the stupid person who doesn't, who just kind of obeys. There is just something much more, like he can do, quote unquote, believe the propaganda. Maybe it's not that. So I would just say COVID was a black pilling event for me. Looking back, the Iraq War was too, although I mistakenly thought it was a Republican problem, which it's far from a Republican problem. It's not like the Republicans are going to fix it either. It's not like the Democrats are going to fix it either. But like neither the military-industrial complex nor COVID, both have made me kind of, on a macro level, depressed. So maybe I should, on a micro level, just have kids, to solve that. But see, like, I can't fix that. I don't think my kids will fix that. I do think, like, to go back to my overplaying my hands, I do think on paper we have, quote unquote, less freedom now, to be quite concrete, than we did in 1800 United States, especially for people like me, because of a variety of reasons: the erosion of formal rights, as well as the erosion of informal rights and the rise of the managerial state. Yes, we have a lot more technology, which may cancel out some of that stuff. I mean, I can fly to anywhere in the world. I can do all those things, but it's only dependent on that sort of managerial regime. So this is somewhat going outside of the initial topic that we're doing, but I will say that, like, I do think intellectuals are more aware of the situation than non-intellectuals. And so to me, it's not surprising that they have, it's a kind of suicide. It's not direct suicide. You don't have enough willpower to do it, but you don't have enough willpower to continue on yourself. That's a point that Alexander McIntyre, not to keep going back to, but he had a lecture, because people like Brian Kaplan will make the point that children are kind of egoism. And McIntyre criticizes that. So does Doug Wilson. However, in practice, to some extent, children are literally a mini version of you. And it's interesting seeing my siblings have children, because I can see them in their kids, and vice versa. I can see, oh, this is what you were like 20 years ago. Ah, I get it. So in that straightforward way, I think egoism is an underrated mentality here, and like you're going to be faced with the same problems. So that's my concluding comment. To some extent, this is a provocative title, but to some extent, it's not a provocative title at all. I think people, and more people, are doing this now than ever before. Again, it might have ticked up a little bit. Actually, there's some data to suggest that in some corners has ticked up. Fertility rates have ticked up in some corners. But that's my concluding comment. Thanks for doing this episode. Interesting topics within. Thanks for listening to my rant. Any other topics? Any other points? That'd be great.
No, I mean, when it comes to the college professor type, I mean, I suppose you're saying, you might own a plumbing firm or whatever, and that's not going to make much cultural influence. But then I suppose then the question is, how much influence does a college professor have? I mean, I'm not sure on the formal qualifications background for, say, someone like Elon Musk, but he's kind of an industrialist, and he seems to have more influence than the college professors do at present. So I suppose what this gets down to is elite formation and how types of elite have influence. Whilst I do think ideas are very important, more so than many would give credit for today. But the college professor himself isn't necessarily someone who has great influence, unless he's at some elite institution, in which case he might. Also, as well, even if that guy wasn't a college professor, whether he would have loads of children, he may just dispositionally not be the guy who would, or, as I say, would be generally not the most sort of masculine, virile individual. And I mean, that's a caricature, to some extent to college professors, but I don't think it's necessarily entirely off base. So that would be my sort of final point. This is an interesting topic. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibbertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibbertyshow@gmail.com.